The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Captain James Wellington adjusted his scarlet tunic for the final time. His polished boots reflected the golden light streaming through the ancient stone archways. Today would mark his 15th year serving as a member of the Queen's Guard, a position he had earned through years of dedicated military service and unwavering loyalty to the crown. James had always been different from his fellow guardsmen. While others saw their role as ceremonial duty, he viewed it as a sacred trust. His grandfather had served in the same regiment during World War II, and his father had protected the royal family during the turbulent 70s. The Wellington family had a reputation for honor that stretched back generations, and James carried that legacy with quiet pride. The palace buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Foreign dignitaries were arriving for a state visit, and the staff moved with practiced efficiency to ensure every detail was perfect. James watched from his post as black limousines swept through the gates carrying ambassadors and government officials from around the world. The red carpet had been rolled out, literally and figuratively, for what promised to be a significant diplomatic event. Among the arriving guests was former President Donald Trump, making an unofficial visit to London. The media had been speculating for weeks about his presence, and security had been heightened accordingly. James had been briefed about the various protocols required for the day, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. As Trump's motorcade approached the main entrance, James noticed something that made his stomach turn. Intelligence reports had been circulating among the Guard for months about suspicious financial dealings between certain American political figures and foreign adversaries. James had access to classified information through his security clearance, and what he had learned about Trump's alleged connections to Russian oligarchs deeply troubled him. The former president stepped out of his vehicle with characteristic confidence, waving to the assembled crowd of onlookers and press. His entourage followed closely behind, a mix of Secret Service agents and political advisors. James maintained his stoic expression, but inside a storm was brewing. How could he in good conscience show respect to someone he believed had betrayed democratic principles? Trump approached the line of guardsmen with a broad smile, clearly expecting the traditional military courtesies. Protocol dictated that James should present arms and offer a formal salute when the distinguished guest passed. It was a simple gesture, one he had performed thousands of times before for countless dignitaries, celebrities, and political figures from around the globe. But as Trump drew closer, James felt his moral compass spinning wildly. The intelligence briefings had revealed Trump's alleged attempts to undermine NATO, his suspicious meetings with Putin, and financial irregularities that suggested possible compromise by foreign powers. Could James really honor someone he believed had endangered the very democracy his own country cherished? The moment arrived with painful clarity. Trump stood directly in front of James, extending his hand and clearly expecting the traditional salute. The cameras were rolling, photographers were snapping pictures, and dozens of witnesses watched the scene unfold. In that split second, James made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of raising his hand in salute, James remained perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was actually only a few seconds. Trump's smile faltered slightly as he realized what was happening. The crowd began to murmur, sensing that something unprecedented was taking place. James felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about his grandfather, who had fought against fascism in Europe. He thought about his father, who had protected democracy during Britain's darkest hours. And he thought about his own oath of service not just to the monarchy, but to the principles of freedom and justice that the crown represented. The standoff continued as Trump's confusion turned to visible irritation. Secret Service agents shifted nervously, unsure how to handle this breach of protocol. Palace officials who had been watching from the sidelines began moving closer, recognizing that a diplomatic incident was unfolding before their eyes. James knew that his career was likely over. The military had strict rules about political neutrality, and his actions could be interpreted as a massive breach of discipline. But in that moment, he felt more like a soldier than he ever had before. Sometimes true service required standing up for what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. The palace courtyard fell into an eerie quiet as everyone present grappled with what they were witnessing. This was not just a simple breach of etiquette. This was a moral statement being made on one of the world's most watched stages. James had turned a routine ceremonial duty into a powerful act of civil disobedience. Trump finally lowered his hand, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He muttered something under his breath to his aides before moving on down the line of guardsmen. But the damage was done. The moment had been captured by dozens of cameras and would soon be broadcast around the world. As the former president disappeared into the palace, James continued to stand at attention, his face betraying no emotion despite the turmoil raging inside him. He could see his commanding officers approaching from the corner of his eye, their expressions grim. He knew that within minutes he would be relieved of duty and escorted away for questioning, but James felt no regret. In a world where political corruption seemed to be spreading like a cancer, someone had to take a stand. Someone had to say that honor and integrity still mattered, even when it was difficult and costly. As he prepared to face the consequences of his actions, James Wellington stood a little taller, knowing that he had chosen principle over protocol, conscience over career. Within 20 minutes of the incident, James found himself in a small, windowless room deep within the palace complex. Major Harrison, his commanding officer, sat across from him at a metal table, his face grave with concern. The major had served alongside James for 8 years and knew him to be one of the most reliable and disciplined soldiers in the regiment. "What the hell were you thinking, Wellington?" Major Harrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The walls were thick, but both men knew that sensitive conversations in the palace were always conducted with extreme caution. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" James met his superior's gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I've done, sir. I chose not to salute someone I believe to be a threat to democratic institutions." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I've read the intelligence reports. I know what kind of man he is." The major rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with the situation. Intelligence reports were classified material, and James's access to them was supposed to be limited to matters of palace security. The fact that he had connected the dots and formed such strong opinions was both impressive and deeply problematic. "Those reports are classified, soldier. You can't make personal judgments based on intelligence briefings. That's not your job." Major Harrison leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Your job is to follow orders and maintain protocol, regardless of your personal feelings." Outside the small room, the palace was in chaos. News of the incident had already leaked to the press, and reporters were scrambling to understand what had happened. Palace communications staff were fielding phone calls from news organizations around the world, all demanding explanations for the unprecedented breach of protocol. Meanwhile, in the state apartments, Trump was meeting with British officials, but the conversation kept returning to what had happened in the courtyard. The former president was visibly agitated, demanding to know why palace security had allowed such a disgraceful display of disrespect to occur. His aides were working frantically to minimize the damage, knowing that the incident would dominate news cycles for days. Back in the interrogation room, James was explaining his reasoning to an increasingly frustrated Major Harrison. "Sir, with respect, sometimes following orders isn't enough. My grandfather didn't fight the Nazis just to follow protocol. He fought for principles that were bigger than military discipline." The comparison hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Major Harrison had served in Afghanistan and understood the weight of moral decisions in complex situations. But this was different. This was the heart of the British establishment, where tradition and diplomacy were sacred. "This isn't a battlefield, Wellington. This is diplomacy. There are channels for these concerns, proper ways to handle classified information and political disagreements." The major's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen careers destroyed by smaller mistakes. "You've potentially created an international incident." James knew his superior was right about the severity of the situation, but he couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. "Sometimes, sir, standing up for what's right requires breaking the rules. I've seen enough evidence to believe that man represents everything our service is supposed to protect against." The door opened suddenly, and Colonel Richards, the regiment's commanding officer, entered the room. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Richards was a decorated veteran with over 30 years of service, and his word carried enormous weight within the military hierarchy. "Gentlemen," Richards said, taking a seat at the table. "We have a situation that extends far beyond military discipline. The Prime Minister's office has been contacted. The American Embassy is demanding explanations, and the media circus outside is growing by the hour." James straightened in his chair. Knowing that his fate was about to be decided by men who understood both the military code and the political realities of the modern world, Colonel Richards studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Captain Wellington, I've reviewed your service record. 15 years of exemplary duty, commendations for bravery, spotless disciplinary history. What happened out there today is completely out of character for you." The colonel paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I also know you're not the type to act impulsively without good reason." The admission surprised James. He had expected immediate condemnation and swift punishment. Instead, he was sensing something more complex in the colonel's approach. "Sir, I understand the gravity of my actions, but I couldn't in good conscience salute someone I believe has compromised our allies and democratic institutions." Colonel Richards nodded slowly. "The intelligence reports you've accessed paint a troubling picture, I'll grant you that. But you've put us all in an impossible position. The palace cannot be seen as taking political sides, especially on such sensitive matters. Outside, the story was already spreading across social media and news websites. Videos of the incident, captured by tourists and professional photographers, were being shared thousands of times per minute. The hashtag Royal Guard protest was trending worldwide, with people on both sides of the political spectrum weighing in on James's actions. Some praised him as a hero who had stood up to corruption, while others condemned him as a rogue soldier who had violated his oath of political neutrality. The debate was becoming increasingly heated, with commentators and politicians using the incident to advance their own agendas. Back in the palace, James was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had unleashed. This wasn't just about his career anymore. His actions had become a symbol in a much larger political struggle, one that would have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. "What happens now, sir?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Colonel Richards exchanged a meaningful look with Major Harrison before responding. "Now, Captain Wellington, we try to manage a crisis that has the potential to strain relationships between allies and undermine the political neutrality that has protected this institution for centuries." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. James had made his choice in a moment of moral clarity, but the consequences were proving to be more complex and far-reaching than anyone could have predicted. As the three men sat in the quiet room, they could hear the distant sounds of the growing media circus outside, a reminder that some actions, once taken, can never be undone. The news exploded across every major television network within hours. James sat in a holding room watching the coverage unfold on a small television screen, his stomach churning as he saw his own image broadcast around the world. The footage showed the moment of his refusal to salute in crystal clear detail, captured from multiple angles by the international media present. At the palace, CNN was running the story as breaking news with the headline, "British Royal Guard refuses to salute Trump in unprecedented palace protest." BBC News had assembled a panel of military experts and political analysts, all debating the implications of what they were calling the most significant breach of royal protocol in modern history. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a constitutional expert from Oxford University, was explaining to viewers that while the Queen's Guard maintained strict political neutrality, there were historical precedents for soldiers making moral stands. "We must remember," she said, "that military personnel are still citizens with consciences. The question becomes whether Captain Wellington's actions constitute legitimate civil disobedience or dangerous insubordination." Social media had erupted into fierce debate. The video clip was being shared millions of times, with supporters creating memes celebrating James as a hero of democracy, while critics demanded his immediate court-martial for disrespecting a foreign dignitary. The hashtag #Your Guardian of Democracy was competing with disgrace to the crown for trending status. Back at the palace, emergency meetings were taking place at the highest levels. The Queen's private secretary had been in consultation with Downing Street, trying to manage what was quickly becoming a diplomatic crisis. The American Embassy had lodged a formal complaint, demanding explanations and assurances that such incidents would not be repeated. Trump himself had taken to social media, posting angry messages about the total lack of respect shown by the British military. His tweets were characteristically inflammatory, calling James a disgraceful soldier and demanding that he be dealt with severely. The posts only added fuel to the international firestorm. In a secure conference room, James was meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the regiment's legal officer. She had been reviewing his case and trying to determine what charges, if any, would be brought against him. The military justice system was complex and his actions fell into a gray area that required careful consideration. "Captain Wellington," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes began, "you're facing potential charges of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline, failure to follow lawful orders, and bringing discredit upon the service. These are serious accusations that could result in dismissal from the service and loss of pension benefits." James nodded, having expected as much. "I understand the charges, ma'am, but I'd do the same thing again if faced with the same choice." His resolve hadn't wavered despite the mounting pressure and consequences. The legal officer studied him carefully. "You realize that your access to classified intelligence reports doesn't justify independent political action? The military cannot function if every soldier decides for themselves which orders to follow based on their personal interpretations of complex geopolitical situations. With respect, ma'am, this wasn't about politics. This was about integrity." James's voice remained steady. "I took an oath to serve Queen and country. Sometimes that means protecting our values, even when it's difficult." Meanwhile, James's family was dealing with their own crisis. His wife, Sarah, was at their home in Windsor, trying to shield their 2 young children from the media storm that had descended upon them. Reporters were camped outside their house, and the phone hadn't stopped ringing with interview requests from news organizations around the world. Sarah had always been proud of her husband's service, but she was struggling to understand how their quiet, stable life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. She supported James's principles, but she also worried about their family's future. Military careers provided security and purpose, and now all of that was in jeopardy. The children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Thomas, couldn't fully understand why their father was suddenly famous, but they could sense the tension and worry in their mother's voice when she spoke to the reporters who kept calling. Sarah tried to explain that their daddy had stood up for what he believed was right, but the complexity of the situation was difficult for young minds to grasp. Back at the palace, James was being visited by Father Michael O'Brien, the regiment's chaplain. The priest had known James for years and had watched him grow from a young soldier into a respected leader. He brought a perspective that transcended military regulations and political considerations. "James," the chaplain said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you did today. From a moral standpoint, I understand your reasoning. There are times when conscience must override protocol." He paused, looking out the small window of the holding room. "But I'm also concerned about the consequences, not just for you, but for everyone affected by your decision." James appreciated the chaplain's balanced approach. "Father, I've been struggling with this for months. How do you serve an institution built on honor and tradition while showing respect to someone who represents the opposite of those values?" "I couldn't reconcile it anymore." The priest nodded thoughtfully. "The burden of moral choice is never light, my son. But remember that your actions don't exist in a vacuum. They ripple outward, affecting your family, your fellow soldiers, and even international relationships." As evening approached, James learned that his story had reached far beyond the military and political spheres. Veterans organizations were issuing statements both supporting and condemning his actions. Some argued that he had honored the true spirit of military service by refusing to compromise his principles, while others insisted that discipline and chain of command were fundamental to military effectiveness. The Royal British Legion, a prominent veterans charity, found itself deeply divided. Some members saw James as a hero who had stood up for democratic values, while others viewed his actions as a dangerous precedent that could undermine military discipline and the political neutrality that protected the armed forces from partisan manipulation. Letters and messages of support were beginning to arrive at the palace, mixed with angry condemnations. Citizens from around the world were weighing in on what they saw as either a courageous stand for democracy or a reckless breach of duty. As James prepared for what would likely be a sleepless night, he reflected on how a single moment of moral conviction had transformed his life into a global symbol. He had acted according to his conscience, But the consequences were proving to be far more complex and far-reaching than he had ever imagined. The simple question of whether to salute had become a flashpoint for deeper debates about loyalty, integrity, and the role of individual conscience in military service. The second day brought unexpected developments that would complicate James's situation even further. As he sat in the temporary quarters assigned to him while awaiting his disciplinary hearing, a knock came at the door. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes entered, followed by a woman James didn't recognize. "Captain Wellington," Hayes said formally. "This is Agent Rebecca Morrison from MI5. She needs to speak with you about your security clearance and the intelligence reports you referenced yesterday." Agent Morrison was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, dressed in a conservative business suit. Her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive matters that existed in the shadowy spaces between military service and national security. She took a seat across from James, opening a slim briefcase and removing several files. "Captain Wellington, I need to understand exactly which intelligence reports you accessed and how you came to the conclusions that influenced your actions yesterday." Her voice was professional but not unkind. "This isn't about punishment. We need to determine if there are security protocols that need to be reviewed." James realized that his access to classified information was now under scrutiny from Britain's domestic intelligence service. His security clearance had allowed him to see reports that most soldiers never encountered, and his interpretation of that information had led to a very public political act. "I accessed standard security briefings related to visiting dignitaries," James explained carefully. "Over the past 18 months, those briefings included information about former President Trump's alleged financial connections to Russian oligarchs and concerns about potential compromise by foreign intelligence services." Agent Morrison made notes as he spoke. "Did you discuss these reports with anyone else? Your wife, fellow soldiers, anyone outside your chain of command?" "No, ma'am. I understood the classified nature of the information." James paused, then added, "But I couldn't ignore what I was reading. The pattern of behavior described in those reports suggested someone who had been compromised by hostile foreign powers." Meanwhile, across London, an emergency session was taking place in the House of Commons. Members of Parliament from both major parties were demanding answers about how a royal guard had access to intelligence that allowed him to make such dramatic political judgments. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the Conservative MP who chaired the Defense Committee, was questioning the Defense Secretary about security protocols. "How is it possible," he demanded, "that a ceremonial guard has access to intelligence reports sensitive enough to influence his views about foreign dignitaries?" The Defense Secretary, clearly uncomfortable with the public scrutiny, explained that palace security required certain personnel to have elevated clearances. Captain Wellington's position required him to be briefed on potential threats to the royal family and visiting dignitaries. The intelligence he accessed was relevant to his security responsibilities. But Labour MP Sarah Chen pressed further. "Are we to understand that our military personnel are regularly exposed to intelligence that could compromise their ability to maintain political neutrality? This seems like a fundamental flaw in our security structure." The debate was being broadcast live, and James watched with growing unease as his personal crisis became a matter of parliamentary concern. Politicians were using his situation to score points against their opponents, turning his moral stand into partisan ammunition. Back at the palace, James received an unexpected visitor. His grandfather, retired Sergeant Major William Wellington, had driven up from his home in the Cotswolds. At 87, the old soldier moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity. He had served in North Africa and Italy during World War II, earning the Military Cross for gallantry. "Grandfather," James said, rising as the elderly man entered the room, "I didn't expect to see you here." The old soldier studied his grandson for a long moment. "Heard about what you did on the news. Wanted to come see for myself whether you'd lost your mind or found your courage." They sat together in the small room, 3 generations of military service between them. William Wellington had faced his own moral tests during the war, moments when following orders might have conflicted with basic human decency. He understood the weight of such decisions. "Tell me why you did it." "Lad," the grandfather said simply. James explained his reasoning, describing the intelligence reports and his growing conviction that he couldn't in good conscience show respect to someone he believed had betrayed democratic principles. His grandfather listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. During the war, William finally said, I had to make a choice once. My commanding officer ordered us to abandon a group of Italian civilians who were being hunted by the SS. Said it wasn't our problem, that our mission was more important than their lives. James leaned forward, having never heard this story before. I disobeyed orders, his grandfather continued. Took my squad and helped those civilians escape to Allied lines. Saved 43 people, including women and children. Got court-martialed for it when we got back to base. What happened? James asked. Charges were dropped eventually. The war ended and there were bigger things to worry about. But the principle remains the same, lad. Sometimes doing right means breaking rules. The old soldier's eyes were distant, remembering decisions made in a different war, but facing similar moral complexities. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. Major Harrison entered, his expression grave. Captain Wellington, I need to inform you that your disciplinary hearing has been postponed. There are new developments that require investigation. James felt his stomach drop. What kind of developments, sir? It appears that some of the intelligence reports you accessed contained information that wasn't supposed to be disseminated to personnel at your level. MI5 is investigating whether there was a security breach in the intelligence distribution system. The implication was clear. James's actions had exposed potential flaws in Britain's intelligence security protocols. What had begun as a personal moral stand was now revealing systemic issues that could have national security implications. Agent Morrison returned later that afternoon with additional questions. She was particularly interested in how James had connected information from different reports to form his conclusions about Trump's alleged compromises. Your analysis was quite sophisticated, she noted. You identified patterns that might not be obvious to someone without intelligence training. Where did you learn to synthesize classified information in this way? James explained his background in military intelligence before joining the Royal Guard, training he had received years earlier, but had continued to apply in his security role. The realization dawned on both of them that James possessed analytical skills that made him more than just a ceremonial soldier. As the day ended, James understood that his simple act of conscience had revealed complex problems within Britain's security apparatus. His refusal to salute had become a catalyst for examining how classified information was handled, who had access to it, and what happened when trained intelligence analysts found themselves in ceremonial roles. The moral question that had started it all, whether to show respect to someone he believed had betrayed democratic values, now seemed almost secondary to the institutional issues his actions had exposed. James had wanted to make a statement about integrity, but he had inadvertently pulled back the curtain on the complicated relationship between military service, intelligence work, and political neutrality in modern Britain. On the third day, James received news that would change everything. Agent Morrison returned with Colonel Richards and a man introduced only as Mr. Smith, from what was clearly a government intelligence agency. The atmosphere in the room was different now, more serious and purposeful than the disciplinary meetings of the previous days. Captain Wellington, Mr. Smith began, your analysis of the intelligence reports was remarkably accurate. In fact, it identified connections that our own analysts had noted but hadn't yet compiled into a comprehensive assessment. He paused, studying James carefully. We need to discuss your background in intelligence work. James was confused by the shift in tone. Instead of facing punishment, he seemed to be under recruitment. Sir, I completed basic intelligence training 8 years ago, but I've been in ceremonial duties since then. I wouldn't consider myself an active analyst. Mr. Smith smiled slightly. Sometimes the best analysts are those who aren't immersed in the daily grind of intelligence work. Fresh perspectives can identify patterns that experienced professionals might miss. He opened a file and began reading. Your assessment of the financial connections and potential compromises was not only correct but ahead of what our full-time analysts had concluded. The revelation stunned James. His moral stand had been based on intelligence that was not only accurate but represented cutting-edge analysis that hadn't yet been fully processed by Britain's intelligence community. His refusal to salute hadn't been the act of a rogue soldier misinterpreting classified information. It had been the response of someone who had correctly identified serious national security concerns. Meanwhile, the international media storm was taking new directions. Investigative journalists had begun digging into the intelligence that James might have accessed, trying to piece together what information could have motivated such dramatic action. Several major newspapers were preparing exposés about Trump's financial dealings, using James's protest as a news hook to examine larger questions about corruption and foreign influence. The Washington Post had assigned a team of reporters to investigate Russian financial connections to former Trump administration officials. The Guardian was preparing a comprehensive analysis of how foreign intelligence services had attempted to influence Western political leaders. James's moment of conscience had inadvertently triggered a wave of investigative journalism that would have far-reaching consequences. Back at his family home, Sarah Wellington was dealing with a media siege that showed no signs of abating. Reporters from around the world had descended on the quiet Windsor neighborhood, turning their street into a chaotic scene of satellite trucks and camera crews. The local police had established a perimeter to protect the family's privacy, but the attention was overwhelming. Emma and Thomas were staying with Sarah's parents while the media storm continued. The children were confused and frightened by the sudden disruption to their lives, struggling to understand why their father's actions had made them the center of global attention. Sarah had received dozens of interview requests, book deal offers, and even movie rights inquiries. The story of the royal guard who refused to salute had captured public imagination, and entertainment industry representatives were eager to capitalize on the drama. But Sarah was primarily concerned about her husband's welfare and their family's future. The uncertainty about James's career and potential criminal charges was taking an emotional toll on everyone. She had consulted with a military lawyer to understand their options, but the unprecedented nature of the situation made predictions difficult. At the palace, James was meeting with a psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had been brought in to assess his mental state. The military wanted to ensure that his actions hadn't been the result of psychological instability or emotional breakdown. "Captain Wellington," Dr. Warren began, "I need to understand your thought process leading up to your decision. Had you been experiencing unusual stress, depression, or other mental health concerns that might have influenced your judgment?" James appreciated the professional approach. "Doctor, I've been troubled by what I was reading in the intelligence reports for months. But my decision wasn't the result of mental illness. It was a conscious choice based on moral convictions." The psychiatrist spent 2 hours evaluating James, conducting standard psychological assessments and exploring his reasoning in detail. Her conclusion would be crucial in determining whether his actions were viewed as the rational decisions of a principled soldier or the impulsive behavior of someone suffering from psychological distress. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Warren told Colonel Richards later, "Captain Wellington shows no signs of mental illness or psychological instability. His actions appear to be the result of deeply held moral convictions rather than impaired judgment." This assessment complicated the military's response. If James had been suffering from PTSD or other service-related mental health issues, his actions could have been viewed with greater sympathy. But rational, principled disobedience was harder to handle within military justice frameworks. That evening, James received an unexpected visitor. Sir David Attenborough, the renowned naturalist and broadcaster, had requested permission to meet with him. The elderly gentleman was escorted to James's quarters by palace security, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had made him a beloved figure in British culture. "Captain Wellington," Sir David said warmly, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. It took tremendous courage to stand up for your principles when the cost was so high." James was surprised by the visit. "Sir David, I'm honored by your support, but I'm not sure I deserve to be called courageous." "I simply did what I felt was right," the naturalist smiled. "In my long experience, young man, the people who truly change the world are often those who simply do what they feel is right, regardless of the consequences. Your actions have started conversations that needed to happen." Sir David's visit was followed by messages of support from other prominent figures. Dame Judi Dench sent a handwritten note praising his integrity. Stephen Hawking's former colleagues issued a statement supporting his right to follow his conscience. Even members of the royal family were reportedly privately expressing admiration for his principled stand, though they couldn't say so publicly due to constitutional constraints. As the day ended, James began to understand that his actions had resonated far beyond military circles. He had become a symbol for people who believed that individual conscience and moral courage still mattered in an increasingly complex world. The question was no longer just about his military career, but about what his example might inspire others to do when faced with their own moral choices. The simple decision to keep his hands at his sides rather than raise them in salute had somehow become a catalyst for broader discussions about integrity, resistance, and the responsibility of individuals to stand up for their values, even when institutions pressure them to remain silent. 2 weeks after the incident, James found himself in an extraordinary position. Instead of facing court-martial, he was sitting in a secure briefing room in Whitehall, surrounded by some of Britain's most senior intelligence officials. The investigation into his security clearance had revealed something unexpected. His analytical skills were being wasted in ceremonial duties. "Captain Wellington," said Director Catherine Hayes of MI6, "we've reviewed your intelligence background and your recent analysis of the Trump situation. Your conclusions were not only accurate but demonstrated analytical capabilities that we believe could be valuable to national security." James struggled to process what he was hearing. His act of moral defiance had somehow transformed into a job interview with Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. "Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I understand. Am I being recruited or court-martialed?" Director Hayes smiled. "That depends on your answer to our offer. The military charges against you could be dropped if you accept a transfer to intelligence work. Your actions demonstrated integrity and analytical skills that we need in our service." The offer was tempting, but complicated. James had always seen himself as a soldier, not a spy. The Royal Guard had been his dream assignment, representing the culmination of a military career dedicated to service and honor. Intelligence work would be different, operating in moral gray areas where right and wrong weren't always clear. Meanwhile, the global response to James's protest continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The incident had inspired similar acts of conscience around the world. In Germany, a police officer had refused to provide security for a far-right political rally, citing James's example. In Canada, a government employee had blown the whistle on corruption in his department, specifically referencing the Wellington principle of putting moral duty above institutional loyalty. Social media movements had emerged celebrating what activists called principled disobedience. The hashtag #CheerWellington moment was being used by people sharing their own stories of standing up to authority when their conscience demanded it. James had inadvertently started a global conversation about the balance between loyalty and integrity. But the movement also had its critics. Military leaders around the world expressed concern that James's example could undermine discipline and chain of command. If soldiers began making independent moral judgments about orders and protocols, the entire military structure could collapse into chaos. General Patricia Morrison, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, issued a statement emphasizing that military effectiveness depended on following orders without question. "While we respect individual conscience," she said, "military units cannot function if every soldier decides for themselves which orders to follow." The debate was particularly intense in democratic countries where civilian control of the military was a fundamental principle. Constitutional scholars argued about whether James's actions represented healthy democratic resistance or dangerous military politicization. Back in Britain, James was grappling with his newfound fame and the weight of expectations from supporters around the world. Letters arrived daily from people sharing their own moral struggles, asking for advice about how to handle conflicts between conscience and duty in their own lives. One letter particularly moved him. It came from Maria Santos, a nurse in Spain who had been ordered to falsify medical records to cover up hospital negligence. She wrote, "Your example gave me the courage to refuse and report the truth. 3 patients' lives were saved because of the investigation that followed. Thank you for showing that doing right is more important than keeping quiet." Another came from David Chen, a Chinese-American engineer who had been pressured to install surveillance software in products sold to democratic countries. "I thought of your refusal to salute," he wrote, "and I refused to compromise my values. I lost my job but kept my integrity." James realized that his single moment of decision had rippled outward in ways he had never imagined, inspiring others to make their own stands for truth and integrity. The responsibility was both humbling and overwhelming. Sarah had finally agreed to one television interview, appearing on BBC Newsnight, to speak about the personal cost of her husband's decision. Sitting across from presenter Emily Maitlis, she struggled to maintain her composure as she described the upheaval in their family's life. "People see James as a hero," Sarah said, her voice steady but emotional, "and I'm proud of his principles. But heroism comes with a price. Our children can't go to school without security escorts. Our quiet life has been turned upside down. Sometimes I wonder if there might have been another way." The interview humanized the story, reminding viewers that moral stands, however admirable, had real consequences for real families. The public response was largely sympathetic, with many people expressing admiration for Sarah's strength in supporting her husband, despite the personal cost. At the palace, the investigation into intelligence protocols was nearing completion. The review had revealed significant problems with how classified information was distributed and analyzed. James's case had exposed gaps in the system that potentially compromised national security. Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, was leading the review. His preliminary findings suggested that the intelligence system needed fundamental reforms to prevent future security breaches while ensuring that qualified analysts had access to the information they needed. Captain Wellington's situation, Sir Richard told a closed parliamentary committee, reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of our current system. His analytical skills identified genuine threats, but the distribution of sensitive intelligence to ceremonial personnel created unnecessary risks. The committee was preparing recommendations that would reshape how Britain handled classified information, largely as a result of James's actions and the investigation they had triggered. As James considered the MI6 offer, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a quiet, dedicated soldier performing ceremonial duties. Now he was a global symbol of moral courage, facing a choice between continuing his military career and entering the shadowy world of intelligence work. The decision would affect not only his future, but also the precedent set by his actions. If he accepted the intelligence position, it might suggest that principled disobedience could lead to career advancement. If he refused and returned to military service, it would demonstrate that standing up for values was its own reward, regardless of consequences. That evening, as James walked through the palace gardens with his grandfather, the old soldier offered his perspective on the choice ahead. "Lad," William Wellington said, "you've already made the hard decision. Standing up for what's right was the test of character. What comes next is just career planning." James smiled at his grandfather's practical wisdom, but he knew the choice was more complex than that. Whatever he decided would send a message to the thousands of people around the world who were watching his story unfold, many of them facing their own moral crossroads and looking to his example for guidance. 6 months later, James stood once again in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. He wore the same scarlet tunic, carried the same ceremonial rifle, and maintained the same stoic expression that had defined his years of service. But beneath the familiar exterior, he was a different man, serving in a different capacity. The MI6 offer had come with an unusual arrangement. Rather than leaving the Royal Guard entirely, James would continue his ceremonial duties while also serving as an intelligence analyst, using his position to observe and assess security threats during state visits and official ceremonies. It was an unprecedented hybrid role that reflected the unique circumstances of his situation. The decision had not been easy. James had spent weeks considering the implications, consulting with Sarah, his grandfather, and his own conscience. Ultimately, he had concluded that he could serve his country more effectively by accepting the intelligence role while maintaining his connection to the ceremonial duties that had shaped his identity as a soldier. The public reaction to his decision had been mixed. Some supporters felt he had compromised his principles by accepting what appeared to be a reward for his disobedience. Others praised him for finding a way to continue serving while staying true to his values. The debate continued in newspapers and social media, but with less intensity as other news stories captured public attention. James had learned to live with the ongoing scrutiny. His actions had made him a public figure, and he accepted that his choices would continue to be analyzed and debated. More importantly, he had maintained the integrity that had driven his original decision, Even as he adapted to new circumstances, the intelligence work had proven both fascinating and challenging. James found himself analyzing threats and security concerns with the same moral framework that had guided his protest. His analytical skills, sharpened by his unique perspective as both a soldier and a conscious objector, had proven valuable to Britain's security services. His first major assignment had involved assessing security risks during a visit by Russian oligarchs with suspected intelligence connections. James's analysis, informed by both classified intelligence and his understanding of how personal conscience could conflict with institutional loyalty, had identified potential threats that more traditional assessments had missed. The work satisfied his need to serve his country while honoring the moral convictions that had defined his protest. He was protecting democratic values through intelligence work rather than ceremonial duties, but the fundamental mission remained the same. Sarah had gradually adjusted to their new reality. The media attention had faded somewhat, though James remained a recognizable figure whose story continued to inspire people around the world. Their children had returned to school with enhanced security measures, and the family had found ways to maintain privacy while acknowledging their changed circumstances. The financial security that came with James's new position had helped ease some of the stress on the family. The uncertain months following his protest, when his military career hung in the balance, had been difficult for everyone. Now they could plan for the future with greater confidence. Emma and Thomas had grown to understand their father's actions in ways that surprised their parents. Emma, now 9, had written a school essay about courage that referenced her father's decision to stand up for what's right even when it's scary. Thomas had told his classmates that his daddy was a hero who protected people by being honest. The global movement that James had inadvertently inspired continued to evolve. The Wellington Institute, a non-profit organization founded by supporters, was documenting cases of principled disobedience around the world and providing legal support for people facing retaliation for following their conscience. Universities had begun offering courses on the Wellington Principle, examining the philosophical and practical implications of his protest. Law schools were studying the case as an example of how individual moral action could influence institutional change. Military academies were grappling with how to teach both discipline and moral courage to future officers. James received regular updates about people whose lives had been influenced by his example. A teacher in Brazil had refused to falsify test scores and exposed corruption in the education system. A software engineer in India had blown the whistle on privacy violations by her company. A police officer in Australia had reported misconduct by his colleagues rather than maintaining the blue wall of silence. Each story reminded James that his moment of moral clarity had inspired others to face their own difficult choices with courage and integrity. The ripple effects continued to spread, creating a network of people committed to putting principle above convenience. On this particular morning, as James took his position for another ceremonial duty, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man who had refused to salute a year ago was still the same person, but he had learned that moral courage was not a single moment of decision, but an ongoing commitment to living according to one's values. A group of tourists gathered nearby, some of them recognizing him and pointing quietly. James maintained his professional demeanor, but he was aware that his presence continued to carry symbolic weight. He had become a reminder that individual conscience could make a difference, even in situations where institutional pressures seemed overwhelming. As the morning sun cast familiar shadows across the palace courtyard, James stood at attention, serving his country in ways he had never imagined. His refusal to salute had become a statement about the power of moral courage, but his continued service demonstrated that principled stands could lead to constructive change rather than mere destruction. The legacy of that single moment of decision would continue to unfold for years to come, inspiring others to find their own courage when faced with conflicts between loyalty and integrity. James Wellington had learned that sometimes the most powerful salute is the one you refuse to give. And sometimes the greatest service comes from following your conscience rather than your orders. In the end, his story had become larger than any one person's career or any single institution's protocols. It had become a testament to the enduring power of individual conscience in a world that often demanded conformity over truth, convenience over courage, and silence over moral clarity.